In this video for lecture 34, we are going to leave behind aerobic training and anaerobic training and instead look at a different kind of training, in this case, strength training. This will be our first of two lectures on strength training, also known as resistance training. So for this lecture, we're going to look at the neural mechanisms that can help us explain some of the increases in strength that we will experience after a period of strength training. How does strength training increase muscle size? We'll look at the two possible mechanisms for that. And then what are the changes in fiber types that are caused by resistance training? Finally, I say explain figure 13.16, and that's where we're going to start. So here's figure 13.16, and this shows the neural and muscular adaptations and how they contribute to attainment of muscular strength. What this figure really is a time course of these changes. Note along the x-axis we have time as it increases. And this essentially is out over years by the time you get to the end of this graph. We also have basically three different lines drawn on this graph. The first one is strength. And so this is just overall strength. We can see that from the beginning of any sort of resistance training, we will see a rapid increase in strength that eventually levels off. Then we have the two different mechanisms that are responsible for these gains in strength. The first one is neural, and this is shown in the red line. This increases rapidly at first and then obviously plateaus quite rapidly as well, whereas hypertrophy, that is the increase in muscle size. That takes a while to start, but then you can see after about this point here that any changes in overall strength are going to almost exactly be paralleled by the changes in hypertrophy, which showing that those gains in strength after the neural component has plateaued are all generated by the increases in muscle size. I should point out that the graph that shows these data points out here at the right side of this, these are mostly speculative because, as is pointed out on the left side of the graph, most training studies are done in this very brief time period, simply because, of course, doing long-term studies is hard to do. They're expensive, subjects drop out, graduate students graduate, all of these sorts of things make it hard to do long-term studies. And so most training studies are going to be in the 8 to 20 week range. Even 20 weeks is pretty long. And so what you can see is, yes, we're going to see increases in strength over this time, but we may not see increases in hypertrophy until maybe 6 or 8 weeks of training. Whereas the neural components we'll see right away, and again, those will start to plateau at maybe 6 to 12 weeks. So if you see strength training studies of only 8 weeks, and they're trying to measure muscle hypertrophy, they may not find much because it just hasn't happened yet. So for the rest of this lecture, we're going to look at, first off, the changes in these neural mechanisms that are going to generate some of these strength gains, especially early on. And then we'll switch to hypertrophy and specific changes within the muscle itself. So let's start with the nervous system and some of these mechanisms that will going to help us increase strength right away. There are 4 of these mechanisms, and so let's start with the neural pathways in the brain itself. So what we have here on the left side of this is the brain and spinal cord, and the notation here will be that this upper motor neuron that's shown, this is where our motor program will begin. So your primary motor cortex, you'll develop the plan to lift the weight. It has to go down the spinal cord. You'll synapse with then a motor neuron, and this is called the alpha motor neuron. Of course, its cell body is in the gray matter of the spinal cord. It will then exit through the anterior horn and then make its way to the muscle fiber. This brings us to our first mechanism, which is the activation of motor units, and we know that this is called recruitment. You'll remember this from Anatomy and Physiology 1, where we talked about motor units. So in this figure here, we're showing the cell bodies in the spinal cord. And we have two alpha motor neurons here labeled alpha 1 and alpha 2. If it's some sort of a light exercise that we're doing where we don't need to produce much force, we might activate one of these motor units, and then as we add more force, we'll activate another one. Well, as we practice doing this in strength training, we get better at recruiting our motor units. And so we can activate more muscle fibers, which then gives us more strength. So that's the first neural adaptation. The second adaptation in the nervous system is rate coding. This is more commonly referred to as the firing frequency of the motor neurons. And so this is the rate at which action potentials are going down the alpha motor neurons and stimulating the muscle fibers. And so I've shown here, this is another figure from our anatomy and physiology textbook. Then the bottom point remains greater stimulus frequency results in greater force production. If we look at the upper left panel, we can see that low frequency stimulation produces low force. So these are muscle twitches. This might be something like one stimulus every 2 seconds or one stimulus per second. And what are you left with? This force of contraction. It's not all that great. On the other hand, if we look at the bottom right, we can see a high frequency stimulation and high force. And so now we're stimulating very rapidly, maybe 50 stimuli a minute or 50 action potentials per minute. And you can see we have this nice smooth contraction called tetanus, and also we have a much higher force. So this is another adaptation of the nervous system. We can drive our motor units at higher firing frequencies after we've done or engaged in strength training. The third neural adaptation is called synchronization of motor units. In this example, we show the electrical activity that's measured in muscles of someone doing jumping, this plyometric jump. In both the untrained state, that's the dashed line, and then after a period of training, which is in the solid line. So you can see that at time 0 in this graph, that corresponds with the person hitting the ground, and then immediately switching gears or switching directions and then trying to jump as high as they could. In the untrained condition, you can see the coordination of their electrical activity. So this would be the sum total of all of the action potentials that are happening in the muscle. That this is spread out over 200 milliseconds. Over 200 milliseconds. Whereas in the trained state, you can see all of their motor unit firing occurs in about 100 milliseconds. So it's all done in half the time. And so this is evidence that the nervous system has learned how to activate all of those motor units at a precise moment, and all of them simultaneously. The fourth mechanism within the nervous system that allows us to increase strength is a reduced or a removal of neural inhibition. And the example I'll give here is in the Golgi tendon organ, which is one of those mechanoreceptors within muscle. It monitors the amount of force being produced near the tendon. In this example, the subject is doing some knee extensor exercises, and so the active muscle here is going to be the quadriceps, and the antagonistic muscle is going to be here, the hamstring. So we'll talk in a second about how those are going to work. Back to the Golgi tendon organ, what it does is it senses force being produced near the tendon, and in the blue neuron, this is an afferent fiber, it's going to send its impulses back through the dorsal root into the spinal cord, and here it's going to synapse with interneurons. And those interneurons are then going to synapse with two different alpha motor neurons. First, let's take the red one. The red neuron goes back to the primary muscle that is associated with the Golgi tendon organ. In this case, this is the quadriceps. And this purple neuron goes to the antagonistic muscle, in this case, the hamstring. So in the normal activation of the Golgi tendon organ, it would send impulses through its afferent fiber, this blue neuron, back into the spinal cord, and then it will synapse again with the interneurons. And now we can look at what exactly happens within the spinal cord. First off, look at the synapses between the Golgi tendon organ and the interneurons. These are both plus, and so that means those are stimulatory or excitatory synapses, and so we will activate action potentials within the interneurons. The interneurons then will synapse with the alpha motor neurons, and normally there's a plus and a minus, and so what we'll do is we'll have a negative or an inhibitory synapse here with the red motor neuron. That's the one going back to the quadriceps. So that will inhibit the firing of that alpha motor neuron and silence or at least reduce the force in the quadriceps. Maybe we reduce the number of motor units being activated. So the force is decreased. At the same time, it will activate the purple motor neuron, the one going to the hamstring. In this case, you're going to activate the hamstring muscle. Well, that will promote knee flexion rather than extension, so it sort of inhibits the movement. With repeated strength training, the sensitivity of the Golgi tendon organ is reduced, and so it sends less, I'll put a minus here, less traffic or fewer action potentials into the spinal cord, and so you get less neural inhibition of the quadriceps, less activation of the hamstrings, and so ultimately force is increased. I forgot to write my number 4 here. This is the fourth mechanism for nervous system adaptations to strength training. So there's the 4 mechanisms for increased strength. And these we know occur within the first 4, 5, 6 weeks of strength training, and even earlier than that. So you can imagine if you have not been lifting weights for a while and you start a new strength training program, you'll do the, the first exercise session, and of course you may be a little sore. You go to the second one and you probably haven't noticed any gains in strength, but by the third and the fourth session, this is maybe only after 4 or 5 days, maybe 6 days, you can noticeably see that you are stronger. So these nervous system adaptations we know occur rapidly. And how do we know it's the nervous system? Well, because as of yet you cannot have measured any hypertrophy within the muscle. The muscles haven't gotten any bigger, and yet you've gotten stronger. So let's move on to changes in skeletal muscle size, and there are 2 potential mechanisms for this. The first is hyperplasia, the second is fiber hypertrophy. So of course, if your muscles get bigger after exercise training, strength training, which we know occurs at about 8 weeks and beyond, this could be due to an increase in the number of muscle fibers, that's hyperplasia, or I should say, and/or it can be due to an increase in the size of the individual fibers themselves. That's called hypertrophy. And so I'm going to show you over the next few figures some of the ways we can study this. It is hard to study this fully in humans, of course, because we can't take out the entire muscles. We can do muscle biopsies, and we can study the size of individual muscle fibers, but we can't count all of the fibers. But we can do this with animals. So one way to do this is to train cats to do some what we would call weightlifting, or at least resistance training. So you can make some kind of a lever apparatus, which is shown here in the cat's cage, and you can connect a weight to it so that in order to get some food, it has to move this lever to lift this load. And then, of course, the cat will do this over and over again to get more food. So this is one way we can induce endurance training in animals. So going back to one of our mechanisms, the first one was hyperplasia. So this has been shown in animals. This has not been shown in humans. And this notion of fiber splitting. So we have seen that if you look at individual fibers in different sections of the muscle, whereas what it looks like at the top here, there's one single fiber, but at the bottom it's 2. So we think that this notion of fiber splitting might occur. That's when the muscle fiber gets too large, it actually will split into 2 because the volume of the cytoplasm is now too big for the sarcolemma. So there is evidence of this occurring in some animals. Birds, for sure, this occurs in, and maybe even some other animals, I'm not sure which, maybe even cats. But there is very little evidence that this occurs in humans. Instead, we think that the mechanism that occurs to explain the increase in muscle size with strength training in humans is fiber hypertrophy. And so this is a picture of a subject's muscle fibers. So these are microscopic. We can see that on the left, in the untrained muscle, is a very small fiber size, whereas the right, the muscle has been trained, and these fibers are much, much larger. It looks like about twice the size. We absolutely know this occurs in humans. Muscle fibers do get bigger. Study after study has shown this, and in fact, it can explain about 90 to 95% of the increase in total muscle size. So we know this is probably the main, if not only, mechanism to increase muscle size in humans. Additionally, we know that the increase in muscle fibers size, fiber hypertrophy, occurs mostly in type 2 fibers. So type 2, the fast twitch fibers, seem to hypertrophy more than type 1 fibers. We're not sure why this occurs, whether it's the type 2 fibers carrying more of the load, or they are just simply more prone to hypertrophy, where our type 1 fibers are not. But whatever the reason, the increase in size in type 2 fibers is greater than the size in type 1. The final point I'll make regarding muscle fibers is that there is a fiber type shift with strength training. And as you would suspect, it is the opposite direction from that we see in aerobic training. So in this case, we see a shift from slow to fast fiber types. Recall with aerobic training, we saw a fast to slow. So type 2X would become type 2A, and type 2A would shift to type 1. Well, with strength training, we mostly see this shift within the type 2, the fast twitch fibers. And in this case, you'll see type 2X shift to a type 2A. So we'll see a decrease in the percentage of type X fibers and an increase in the percentage of type 2A. We don't really see much shift within the type 1 fibers, though. They don't go to type 2, and then type 2 doesn't seem to go to type 1 with strength training. So that concludes this video for Lecture 34 and our first strength training video.